In the lectures and class discussions we have had until now, we have frequently talked about differences in patterns of behavior and of well-being among different racial and ethnic groups. In these materials, we have frequently referred to groups labeled such as Black, White, Hispanic, Asian, and American Indian. What we have not done yet is to define these categories and to determine the origins of this manner of dividing the U.S. populations. Before we go further, I would like us to consider the question above. What do we mean when we say race? Rather than going to Wikipedia, let's see what the Oxford English Dictionary has to say about the word race. In the online version of the OED, there are two principal definitions given for this word. The first is a group of persons, animals, or plants connected by common descent or origin. This suggests that we approach race as a matter of ancestry. The alternative definition provided says that race is one of the great divisions of mankind having certain physical peculiarities in common. This definition approaches race as based on physical characteristics, that is, on the way people look. Which approach should we take? To provide an answer to this question, let's first look at the way the U.S. government, through its Census Bureau, approaches the concept of race. As part of the 2010 National Census, respondents were asked two questions about each member of their household. Question number 8 asked, is this person of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Immediately following it, question 9 then asked, what is this person's race? According to government policy, the issue of Hispanic origin is separate from the issue of race. In defining the concept of race, the Census Bureau states that the racial categories included in the census questionnaire generally reflect a social definition of race recognized in this country and not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. Prior to 1997, the Census Bureau defined 4 racial categories for people to choose from: white, Black, American Indian, or the broad category Asian Pacific Islander. In 1997, the Federal Office of Management and Budget published a revision to the racial categories to be used by the Census Bureau and other federal agencies in gathering population data. The new regulations define the following 5 racial categories: white, Black, American Indian, Asian, and a new category referred to as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. In the 18th century, the United States and its European forebears considered the different populations around the globe to be distinct subspecies of Homo sapiens. In a 1758 edition of a book titled Systema Naturae, Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus reported on his study of both plants and animals, seeking to establish a taxonomy of all animal life on the globe. In that book, he identified what he believed to be the 4 subspecies of humans and provided what he saw as their defining behavioral characteristics. He described these 4 subspecies as Afro-Niger or African Black, which he described as black, crafty, and governed by caprice; Asiaticus luridus, which translates as Asian Yellow, whom he saw as sallow, severe, and ruled by opinion; Americanus rubescus, American Red, whom he described as reddish, obstinate, and regulated by custom; and Europaeus albus, European White, whom he described as white, gentle, and governed by law. We should note that, with the exception of the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander category, the categories described by Linnaeus are identical to those used by the Census Bureau of the United States government for most of the 20th century. Johann Blumenbach, who was a contemporary of Linnaeus, differed somewhat in his human taxonomy, specifically in regards to how to categorize the native peoples of the Pacific Islands, such as native Hawaiians, Samoans, and Tongans, referred to by Blumenbach as the Malay. Writing in 1781, Blumenbach argued that the human species had 5 subcategories, the 4 identified by Linnaeus, plus the Malay as a separate category. We should note that the categories described by Blumenbach are identical to those used by the United States government starting in 1997 and after. Looking back on more than 200 years of racial categorization in the United States, we can ask the question, who was right, Linnaeus or Blumenbach? One way to answer this question is to look at the genetic makeup of various population groups around the globe and to determine if there is a genetic basis for the groups we categorize as races. Rosenberg and colleagues were able to obtain DNA samples from more than 1,000 individuals representing 52 distinct population groups around the globe. Each of these population groups had remained geographically stable for a number of generations. They tested each sample to determine the genetic structure of 377 different microsatellites, which are small segments of DNA without any known function. They posed the following question. Without knowing the geographic origin of the samples, is it possible to sort the samples into groups based on genetic similarities and differences that correspond to categories of race used in the United States? They mixed up all the samples without labels and gave them to the lab technicians using a DNA nucleotide sequencer and a computer program to sort the samples, which did have coded numbers but not labels as to origins. Gave them to the programmers to sort the samples based upon genetic similarities and differences. They asked the following questions. Can you separate these samples into N genetically distinct groups? They varied N, the number of groups that the computer was to sort the samples into, from 2 through 6. Once the samples were sorted into each of the N groups, they then reconnected the samples with the geographic location based upon the code on the sample from which they were collected. They then asked, do the groups identified based upon genetic variation alone correspond to known geographic groups? From this analysis, they were able to determine that about 98% of all genetic material in the microsatellites they studied was identical among all subjects. Of the approximately 2% of genetic material that varied among individuals and groups, the within population differences among individuals from the same geographic region accounted for 93 to 95% of the variation, while the differences among major groups constituted only 5 to 7% of the variation. That is, 5 to 7% of the 2% that actually varied. Without using prior information about the origins of individuals and based only on this 0.14% of variation in the genetic information, researchers were nonetheless able to identify 6 main genetic clusters. 4 of these clusters correspond to the 4 traditional races identified in the U.S. Using fewer than 4 categories, however, gave some very interesting results. When the computer was instructed to sort the samples into 2 groups, the researchers got the following results. Group 1 was comprised of Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, and North Africa. Group 2 included East Asia, Oceania, which is the Pacific Island group that Blumenbach referred to as the Malay, and the Americas. When asked to sort the subjects into 3 groups, the computer separated out Sub-Saharan Africa from its previous group. So we have Group 1, Sub-Saharan Africa, Group 2, North Africa, Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, and Group 3, East Asia and Oceania and the Americas. When the computer was programmed to divide the samples into 4 groups, the resulting groups corresponded largely to the 4 racial categories originally identified by Linnaeus. Group 1, Europe, Middle East, Central Asia. Group 2, Sub-Saharan Africa. Group 3, East Asia, Oceania. Group 4, the Americas, which includes the American Indians and other people indigenous to the Americas. So, based upon this stage of the analysis, it appears that Linnaeus was correct in his categorization of humans globally. But then they looked at what happens when you sort it into 5 groups. And when instructed to identify 5 groups, the computer split East Asia and Oceania into separate groups, thus essentially recreating the 5 racial groups identified in 1781 by Blumenbach. So based on this analysis, it seems that it was Blumenbach who was right. Neither Linnaeus, Blumenbach, nor the U.S. Census Bureau has identified a 6th racial group. When instructed to sort the samples into 6 groups, will the 6th group correspond to any racial category we recognize? What they found was very interesting. The original 5 groups remained, with the 6th group being the Kailasha people. Who are the Kailasha? Well, in the northwestern corner of Pakistan lies the Kailash Valleys, which is the home of a non-Muslim tribe known as the Kailasha. The ancestors of the Kailasha once ruled a wide area, but at the time of the Rosenberg study, there were only 4,000 or so Kailasha remaining in those valleys. But they were identified as the 6th group based upon genetics. The original Rosenberg study analyzed genetic variation in 377 microsatellites, which are segments of DNA with anywhere from several to several dozen individual nucleotides. The same research group again studied the original research database, measuring instead genetic variation of 650,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, referred to as SNP and pronounced SNP. SNPs measure the pattern of variation at specific 1 nucleotide locations on chromosomes. Using variations in SNPs rather than microsatellites, the researchers found the same genetic distribution when measuring 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups, and 5 groups. However, when they asked the computer for a 6th group, this group included not just the Kailasha, but rather the entire area of South Asia, including India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Using microsatellites, the computer could identify at most 6 population groups. However, when using SNPs, the computer was able to identify a 7th group, with the 7th group being those people of North Africa and parts of the Middle East. What have we learned from these studies? In 2011, Noah Rosenberg, the first author on the original study, published a paper summarizing their findings. In that paper, he posed a series of questions and provided answers for these questions based on their genetic research. He asked whether distinctive genetic alleles exist for specific geographic regions that consistently distinguish individuals in one group from those in other geographic groups. He was able to conclude that among the alleles they considered, none was present in all members of any one region and absent from individuals outside the region. As a fraction of all alleles that diverged strongly from other regions did exist, but they were rare. He then asked how different 2 individuals from within the same local population are genetically when compared to the difference between 2 individuals chosen from any 2 populations anywhere in the world. He found that the mean level of difference for 2 individuals from the same population is almost as great as the mean level of difference for 2 individuals chosen from any 2 populations anywhere in the world. To what extent is it possible to determine the genetic ancestry of an individual using the alleles in his or her genome? While individual loci of genetic information do provide relatively little information, he did conclude that using multi-locus genotypes, it is possible to estimate individual ancestry on a continental basis, at least at a broad regional level, but in some cases actually at a more specific population level within continental groups. From these studies, we can identify certain genetic principles. Based on rules of logic, we know that establishing that if A exists, therefore B also exists, does not mean that we can also say, given B, we can then determine A. Applied specifically to the question at hand, these rules of logic suggest that if I know your specific genetic information, I may be able to infer your geographic ancestral origins. However, this does not imply that if I know your ancestral origins, I can infer your genetic information. There is very little we can conclude about an individual's risk for any specific disease by knowing the region or regions of their ancestral origins. This is why the U.S. Census Bureau cautioned that, quote, the racial categories included in the census questionnaire generally reflect a social definition of race recognized in this country and not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically, unquote. Another way of saying this is that the category of race as used in this country is socially constructed, based on a common understanding that has developed over more than 2 centuries, but it is not based on scientific evidence. However, the fact that race is a socially constructed category does not diminish its importance when it comes to issues of human well-being.